Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Hemant Kakkar, Associate Professor of Organizational Behaviour at the Indian School of Business, as our distinguished guest for today's podcast. Before joining ISB Hyderabad, Dr. Kakkar held faculty roles as Assistant and Associate Professor of Management and Organizations at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. He earned his doctoral degree in Organizational Behaviour from London Business School. His research explores how status, influence, and social hierarchies drive judgment and behavior in groups, drawing on both social psychology and evolutionary theory. Dr. Kakkar's work also investigates why individuals choose to engage in both positive and negative forms of deviance in organizational settings. His scholarship has been recognized by multiple honors, including the 2021 Alva H. Champion Junior Outstanding Dissertation Award and top paper prizes from the International Association of Conflict Management and Academy of Management's Conflict Management Division. Dr. Kakkar's research appears in top journals such as the Academy of Management Journal, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and Nature Human Behavior. It has also been highlighted by leading media outlets, including the Washington Post, Forbes, and the Harvard Business Review. At ISB, Dr. Kakkar teaches the core organizational behavior course and has previously taught at both postgraduate and graduate levels at Duke. He is a recipient of the Award for Excellence in Teaching for the MMS program. Prior to his academic career, he worked as a technical consultant at Tata Consultancy Services in India. In this episode, Dr. Hemant Kakkar shares key insights from his research to give a fish or to teach how to fish, examining leaders' autonomy and dependency helping behaviors. It is my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Hemant Kakkar to the conversation. Dr. Kakkar, we are truly honored that you have accepted our invitation and delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Deepak, and thanks for the very nice introduction. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Professor, what initially inspired you to explore the difference between dependency help and autonomy help in organizational settings?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You mentioned, that I worked for a couple of years a long time ago. And, while I was working, so some of these observations came during that time, So, I observed recurring patterns in workplaces, that there can be multiple leaders, they can all be supportive, yet the manner in which they support can be very different, and leader support matters a lot. That's what a lot of management literature talks about, but it doesn't distinguish between how or the manner in which that support is given, so uh, like I said, two leaders might be supportive, but one would step in and take over the employee's task, and the other might guide the employee in figuring out how to do the task. Now, these behaviors, the end goal is similar in both of these behaviors. They resolve employees' issue, but they have very different consequences, in terms of employees' growth and dependence, and very different behavior. And despite a rich stream of work in supportive leadership behavior and related areas, nothing kind of distinguish between these two kinds of helping behavior or these two kind of supportive behavior. And that's what kind of intrigued me to ask this question. Are there differences in the way leaders want to help employees? And that's got me into these autonomy and dependency helping behaviors.
Professor, can you briefly explain the distinction between dependency help and autonomy help and what effects each have on employee growth and empowerment?
Right. So to begin with, both are forms of helping behavior. And helping is something that can allow employees to overcome the task or the problem they are suffering at hand. But they're very qualitative different behaviors, and it kind of goes back to this the way we derive these definitions. We're not the first to talk about it, by the way. Ari Nadler and colleagues have talked about it in more in social psychology and political behavior space, political psychology space, and it comes from this famous proverb, which is well known, which is there, which is that give a man a fish and he eats for a day, but teach a man how to fish and he eats for a lifetime. And the same kind of distinctions we can draw between dependency and autonomy help, where dependency help involves a leader solving a problem on employees' behalf. Suppose we are working in an IT company, a programmer has a problem with their code. They can go to the leader. Leader is helpful, solves the problem, saying, okay, the error from the code is gone, but has not explained the underlying logic or reasoning, how that problem was resolved. So what it does is it allows employees to move forward, but at the same time, it creates dependency on that leader, because the next time employee has the same problem, he or she has to come back to their leader to ask for to help. Whereas in contrast, which is teaching how to fish, the same coder is stuck with the code. He or she goes to their leader. The leader offers, not solves the problem for them by just saying, hey, I've removed the error, but tells them, guides them on why that error is, gives them hint, gives them reasons, helps them clarify what the underlying problem is. And by giving those hints or explanation, it helps employees to understand, what was the crux of the problem, and that helps employees to learn what was missing in their understanding, in their code, in their logic, and so forth. So what it does is that the next time they have a similar problem, they don't have to go to the leader, because they now understand what was the issue. So, and that's the key distinction here, where dependency is like leader takes over the problem, solves it for the employees, whereas when it comes to autonomy help, leader guides them gently, nudges them, gives them help, helps them understand what the issue is. And as a result, in both of these situations, it has different impacts on employees, right? So in one case, the employee is dependent on the leader. In the other case, they are becoming more autonomous on their own. They are learning the problem, and they are growing as an employee, as an individual. So those are the key differences. When it comes to these two types of helping behaviors.
Professor, how do leaders' dominance and prestige orientations influence their tendency to offer dependency versus autonomy help?
Right. So the next step that we had in this research was, uh, are there certain leaders who intentionally, offer these two kinds of help? Because you can see, these two kind of help create different kinds of consequences. One creates dependency, while the other makes the employee more autonomous, more empowers them in many ways. And to understand that who could be those type of leaders, we drew upon this theor- theoretical work on social rank literature. So this is a literature which stems from evolutionary and social psychology, and which talks about, what are the ways in which individuals tend to gain high status or social rank within their groups, within their hierarchies. And they talk about, two broad motivations. One is this idea of dominance, and the other is this idea of prestige. Now, what does dominance means? Dominance are the individuals who tend to gain influence by being very controlling, by being assertive, by being, like it comes from these primates. A lot of this work on dominance come from studying primates, studying baboons, studying chimpanzees. Uh, and of course ethnographic studies are on humans, and they find, one way in which individuals gain status is when they come across like this alpha male, that I am the strong person in the group. I will ensure, that group is secured from external threats, so they act in a very forceful, intimidating manner, and that gives them status. And similar kind of uh, influence tactics you can see parallels in organization. Of course, they don't rule by fear and all in organization. It's very hard, but there are other ways of showing dominance, which is you're being assertive, you're being very confident. If there is some discussion, you speak for a lot more of the time during that duration. So those are the dominance related trait, and the underlying psychology there is this idea to control, just to maintain control over the others, and that's dominance. Whereas prestige uh, is if you go back to again to this ethnographic literature on and evolutionary literature, this form of influence in which people gain status is uniquely related to humans. It is afforded to those individuals who have a lot of knowledge, domain specific knowledge, that others also want to learn, because learning that knowledge will help them adapt to their environment very well. So, for instance, think of it as an old hunter living in some village, but now the hunter is old. He or she cannot hunt, but what this person can do, it can tell other young people which day. which day of the year to hunt, where to go, what time to go, what kind of an animal you might see, how to lay out those traps. So that information is very useful for their group members. Because if they have that information, they can get sustenance and they can survive. And that's what prestige way to influence is, where individuals tend to gain influence by sharing their knowledge, by sharing their expertise, by helping others. And in return, they tend to get a lot of status. And that's what prestige idea of influence is. And even in today's organization, we see all these kind of leaders. You look at Tesla, there's Elon Musk at the helm, very assertive, very forceful, intimidating presence, wants to get things done his way. Whereas in Microsoft, we have Satya Nadella, who talks about empathy, who talks about employee growth, nurturance. So you see different ways in which these leaders lead, and you can broadly put them along these two ideas of dominance and prestige. And that's what we kind of hypothesized in this literature, that given that these dominant leaders, they are driven by this idea of control, and as leaders, you have to help your team members and subordinate. So what's the best way these individuals can offer help, dominant individuals, so that they offer help, yet they maintain control over their subordinates? And that's what we argued. They will be offering more of dependency help rather than autonomy help, because that helps them keep their control. Whereas leaders who are associated with prestige, they don't necessarily care about control. That's not what their underlying trait is. They like to empower others. And one way to empower others is by giving them more autonomy help and less dependency help. So that became the basis for us to say, leaders who are associated with dominance will offer more dependency help and less autonomy help, while leaders associated with prestige will offer more autonomy help and less dependency help.
Professor, what role does a leader's zero sum mindset play in determining whether they offer empowering or controlling form of help?
Right. So this question gets more into uh, the why of why these leaders offer these two contrasting forms of helping behavior. And what zero sum mindset is, the zero sum mindset is this idea that my success is contingent. I can only make success at the expense of the other person. That's this mindset, zero sum mindset. The the other extreme version of it is not a zero sum mindset, is both I and the other person can achieve success together. So one thinks that we have there is a fixed pie that only if I want more of it, I can only get at the expense of someone else. Whereas the other thinks, we have a bigger pie. Both of us can have a lot of the cake, how much ever we want. And sometimes it's true that we have fixed resources and one can gain success only at the expense of others. But zero sum mindset is specifically applicable to situations which are not inherently zero sum, where that is one person gain is not necessarily the loss of the other person. And oftentimes certain individuals, depending on certain characteristics, have a zero sum mindset. So people who grew up in wars with a lot of uncertainty, they tend to have a lot of zero sum mindset. So. At this zero sum thinking, they apply in domains where, like I said, inherently the situation is not zero sum. And that kind of explanation we wanted to test whether that is driving, individuals helping behavior. So specifically, because dominant leaders want to have control, and the thinking what they have is that if an employee I empower certain employee and they tend to rise in the organization, then that person can actually poses a threat to where I am, to my position and so forth. And they have this zero sum tendency because of this need for control that they have. And this is what we argued, the more zero sum tendency someone has, the more they would want to offer dependency help and less they would want to offer autonomy help. And going back to our earlier leadership theories on dominance and prestige, we know that dominant leaders have higher zero sum mindset, whereas prestige leaders do not think in such manner. So that's what we argued, that this relationship, that this behavior of dominance and prestige in offering these two different forms of help will be driven by this zero sum mindset. So that was the idea here.
Professor, how does status threat, for example, the fear of losing authority, affect the why dominant and prestige-driven leaders help their employees?
Right. And so this was the variable that we talked about as a situational variable, which allowed us to examine our mechanism even more strongly, which is we made a case why zero sum thinking explains the relationship between dominance and more dependency helping and less autonomy helping is because of this need for control, and because if they offer someone autonomy help, then they can come back and jeopardize their position. So we were like, measure this why not we measure or capture this psychology just directly? And that's what we argued. Status threat is one such construct, one such variable which can help us measure that. And what status threat means is that uh, I am worried that my position as a leader is under threat, or someone else will take over my position. That is what status threat means. So our argument was, if dominant leaders' behavior is driven by zero sum mindset, which is this idea about that my control is threatened, then the construct or psychology which directly measures this, and if this is true, if this is how those leaders perceive that the status threat is high, then we should see that these leaders, dominant leaders, exhibit higher zero sum thinking, and the more higher zero sum thinking they exhibit, the less they will provide autonomy help, and the more they will provide dependency help. So that was one side of the model that we tested, with this status threat. Whereas at the same time, we did not expect status threat to have any effect on leaders associated with prestige, because that's not the underlying motivation based on which they offer help. They are not uh, high on zero sum thinking, and they are not driven by these ideas of control. Rather, they are more driven by the ideas to empower others and help others. So even if prestige leaders might feel high status threat, we did not predict that this would in any ways have an effect on their helping behavior, that is make them offer more dependency help and less autonomy help. And this is exactly what we found, which is uh, when dominant leaders express a higher need of status threat, that is challenges to their leadership position, they felt even more they displayed even more zero sum mindset, zero sum thinking, which then explained more dependency here and less autonomy here. So in a way, this variable was brought in to basically very tightly demonstrate our logic underlying all this model, this how leaders behavior or helping changes, especially those of dominant leaders.
Professor, you develop a new scale to measure autonomy and dependency helping. How does this differ from traditional measures of supportive leadership?
Yeah, that's a good question, because if we go back to traditional versions of supportive leadership, uh, what is supportive leadership? So supportive leadership is a very broad construct. So in some ways, it includes a lot, many different things, not just helping. Supportive leadership is also about how can I take care of my employees' needs and concern. Can I be empathetic to them? Can I listen to them carefully, which helps them overcome certain issues? So supportive, can I coach them in certain ways? Can I offer them some individualized consideration? So supportive leadership is many different things. And there are measures of supportive leadership and so forth. And the literature on supportive leadership goes far back from 70s, housework and so forth, house path goal theory and so forth. But what we were interested in looking at is not this broad array of supportive leadership, which includes many different things, from emotional insurance to managing workload and so forth, many other different things. But we were specifically interested in helping behavior. And when we looked at the broader organizational literature, we did not find measures that was specific for dependency and autonomy helping. So there are a lot of measures of helping and other versions of helping, but none specifically getting at these dependency and autonomy helping. In fact, some of the other work which is not in the OB area, people have tried to develop some of these measures, but they are very broad. They are more at the society level and just beyond organizational context. And we wanted to develop our measures which are specifically for organizational context. So where we can directly tap into leader and employee psychology. So that led us, to develop these measures. And I think it was helpful because if we look at our paper, we demonstrate that these measures that we have developed, they explain, employees behavior or leaders behavior over and above these other measures which are already out there. So in some ways it is tapping into these specific aspects of work behavior that other measures have not been able to do in the past, and shows that these effects are over and above beyond all of those things.
Professor, what practical strategies can organizations adopt to ensure that leaders' helping behavior actually foster long-term employee independence rather than unintentional dependence?
Right. So oftentimes, so the way to think about it is, the kind of incentives or un unintentional sometimes incentives or rewards that organizations uh, reward employees or leaders for their behavior. One of them is, which is very well known, is how much a leader helps their employees. So oftentimes that help is based on that metric is based on supportive behavior on frequency rather than on the fit. That is, given the situation, is there a fit between how leaders are helping their employees? And whenever there is a frequency issue, that is, a more a leader is seen as helpful, the more they are thought to be nice or rewarded. I think that's a trap. So what organizations can do is instead one thing, move beyond these frequency measures of helping and figure out a way is if the leader's help is actually helping employees to grow, employees to become independent, employees to become master their skill, learn on the job. If that is how, if organizations can find way to do it, that will somehow take care of some of these issues, because whether dominant leaders or any other type of leaders who do this kind of behavior, they are mindful of how those behaviors are rewarded. Right now, those behaviors are rewarded based on frequency, and the more you provide dependency help, the more there are chances of increasing frequency because employees will come to you repeatedly. The more you will be visible to others, showing how much you are helping. But in a way, it is not really adding value to organization, adding value to employees. So that's one way. Move beyond these traditional ways of thinking about just frequency of helping. And the other way, and something to a similar extent, similarly to my previous point, is that we find that why these behaviors are happening is because leaders engage in zero sum thinking, because they believe that empowering others could threaten their own status. So, and why does this happen? Because most of the organization have these stacked rank structure where they force fit leaders or employees on these normal curve, and once these force rankings are there on a curve, what it tells you is, my ranking is actually dependent on someone else. I can only be better at the expense of someone else. So organization can actually shift away from these competitive individual focused evaluations and instead promote, a more collective growth and collaboration kind of metrics. For very famously, for instance, Microsoft under Satya Nadella, they eliminated this stack ranking, and introduced metrics which emphasize collaboration, continuous learning, and leader contributions to team development. If those kind of systems can be adopted, it can help reshape, especially dominant leaders' mindset to be less focused on control and competition and more centered on shared success. So if we can find ways to encourage shared success, that would help, and to help leaders see the value of empowering their employees without feeling threatened is very important in all of this exercise, and that's what organizations can actively seek to do. If they do that, then these leaders can actually be able to delegate some of their work which they are doing themselves to those employees if they are these employees are growing. And once you are free from that much of the rote job that you do every day, these leaders will be more free to think broadly, to generate more value, generating ideas or provide more value to the organizations in different ways. So those are some of the things which organizations can think of doing.
Professor, have you found that certain types of task or organizational cultures make autonomy help more beneficial or more difficult to implement?
I mean, this is definitely true that there are, certain cultures where, or certain kind of task where certain kind of help will be more provided more than the other. One very basic example is, if there's a lot of time pressure, if the tasks are done under time constraint, then of course dependency help will be much more in the picture than autonomy help. Uh, but research suggests, and this is kind of similar to what I just said, that autonomy help work best in environment where tasks require learning, judgment or long-term skill development. So what you want in these contexts is teaching employees how to solve problems, enables their capability building, capacity building, and reduces, dependence. Whereas if the tasks are time sensitive or routine, the demand is so immediate, which leads to these dependency help. At the same time, culture also matters. Where do you see autonomy help? And you can go back to some of this wonderful work by Amy Edmondson on psych safety, where she said, when does organization really learn, or when do employees really learn? And that happens, those kind of learning happen where the culture is about psych safety, where employees feel safe in asking questions, in committing mistakes, in committing errors, and learning from them. And basically, organizations which are focused on employee development, these kind of cultures, they reward experimentation and see mistakes as part of growth, making thus employees more receptive to autonomy oriented guidance. Whereas cultures which are very hierarchical or control driven, where mistakes are penalized, or leaders feel status pressure, it just becomes very difficult to provide autonomy here. And in such environments, leaders may default to take over the task rather than, to empower employees and so forth. So both task and culture play a very, very critical role. And it also tells us that if organizations want to have more autonomy kind of help, they need to build these kind of culture, which has a lot of psych safety, which allows mistakes to happen, and in the process, employees to grow.
Professor, in your studies, how did employees perceive and respond to leaders who offered mostly dependency help versus those who promoted autonomy?
Yeah, so we did not exactly measure how did these employees react to some of these leaders' perception or leaders' attribution, or how do they judge those leaders' character and so forth. Those are the kind of things we didn't measure. But what we did in one of the studies, we ran so most of the studies are from two perspectives, where leaders will rate themselves on dominance and prestige kind of thing. Employees will rate kind of the helping behavior they're offering, and then we would run the model and show that there's a relationship between the two. But in one of the studies, what we did was we just asked employees to rate their leaders on dominance and prestige. Then after 2 weeks, we asked them, okay, now tell us what kind of help they provide. So what we do find is that, again, we found support for our model. So what it tells us is that these employees see the leaders in the same way. So dominant leaders so self-report of dominance, that is leaders reporting themselves on dominance or prestige, are kind of correlated with, employees rated dominance and prestige. That is, these leaders are perceived in a similar manner, which is those who were providing dependency help were seen as dominant, and those who were providing autonomy help were seen as prestige. And there's enough literature out there where we know how dominant leaders are in general perceived. So leaders who are dominant, they are generally come across as less likable. People don't tend to like them a lot. They are less warm. They do not. They have less of those social skills. And in a way, these people, they because they rule by fear, they rule by control. As long as they have the control, it's fine. But once that control is gone, they suffer social penalties, right? So that's what they face, because they're not likable. All they care about is their own interests. So that is something we didn't measure, but from the broader literature, we know that is true. And I believe, this is how these leaders would be perceived, even among these employees, who are while offering these dependency or autonomy.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking
Sure.
ahead, what advice do you have for leaders who want to shift from solving problems for employees to empowering them to solve on their own?
Yeah, nice question. A very thoughtful one. I think the first step is self-awareness. Leaders need to recognize when their instinct to, just jump in and fix something, is it driven by efficiency or is it driven by this desire for control? Uh, so, so self-awareness is the key. And if it is driven by a desire for control, then they need to take a step back, from there they need to shift towards empowerment, which requires, making space for employees to think through problem, even if it takes longer in the shorter run. In practice, this could mean asking guiding questions rather than giving solutions, framing mistakes as part of learning, and reinforcing that competence, takes a while to grow. It grows over time. It might also help, like what we talked about, to build site safety, within our working culture, so that employees feel comfortable, at least trying different ways of solving the issues or performing the task. Failing, that's fine. Even if they're failing, that's fine. But eventually, improve. So the important thing here is that leaders should treat this as a developmental investment. The benefit and realize, that these benefits will appear over repeated interactions, and not just in a single moment. So that's what I suggest. I think leaders should be doing. Instead of providing solution, they might ask guiding questions. What options have you considered? Do you need more information? What are the ways you have thought about doing this task? Offer partial guidance, maybe. Start with hints or conceptual directions. Normalize learning, which is communicate that skill development matters more than some kind of an immediate resolution or immediate perfection over a task. Uh, Reinforcing competence, which is acknowledging that it takes a lot of effort and progress to build sustained competence, and that requires a lot of internal motivation as well. So that's the idea, investing in the long term. Autonomy initially has a lot more cost. It takes a lot more effort and time, but it builds capacity, which can reduce dependency over future interactions. So I think that's what leaders can broadly uh, take away from this work.
Dr. Hemant Kakkar, thank you for bringing your research to life by sharing how leaders' approaches to helping, whether fostering autonomy or encouraging dependency, can shape entire workplaces. Your insights into the role of dominance, prestige, and status threat in leadership offer powerful lessons for anyone hoping to empower others and create healthier organizations. We are grateful for your time and expertise on the show today and appreciate your ongoing commitment to advancing our understanding of leadership in action. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deepak. It was a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for featuring my work.